Well, thank you very much. I have to apologize that I don't speak and understand Portuguese, but thank you for that gracious introduction. I like this poster that you made. Right? This Japan is facing the storm, and we're this little paper ship, right? And it does. I think we're a bit more bigger in terms of ship, but I think it catches the the unique situation that I think.
It's an origami anyway.
Okay, that's sure. Okay, I got the spirit of it. Well, thank you anyhow for hosting me. I thank the FHC Foundation, and I thank the Consul of Japan for helping me out. I'm now based in Washington. I'm at the Wilson Center, where I believe Brazil Institute is quite important in Washington in terms of Latin America presence and the presence of Brazil. And this is, in fact, my first visit to Brazil, and I'm very honored to be here. I'm not a messenger of Japanese government or anything. I'm an independent scholar. But I was sent by the Japanese government to tell you and share with you what Japan is thinking, what we're facing. And since I'm an expert on American politics, American foreign policy, and U.S.-Japan relations, so the Minister of Foreign Affairs was worried that I knew nothing about Brazil, so they came and briefed me about Brazil. And they briefed me on the situation, the political situation, and international situation, economic and social sort of situation of Brazil. And sort of they went into sort of the cultural side of the briefing. And I said that, you don't have to brief me on that because, Brazil has been, although I don't speak the language, Brazil and the cultural aspect of Brazil has been an important part of me. And I said yesterday the same thing at the Japan House, but I'm now... in fact, I'm 52 years old today. But
congratulations!
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's nice to have a birthday in Brazil. And for my generation of men, especially, Ayrton Senna, he is just something. He is a big part of us. And when he sort of got into the accident and when he learned that he passed away, it was a big shock for many of us. I mean, we literally cried because it wasn't just he was a fast driver. He had something that he resonated with us. So, in that sense, Brazil was always an important part of me. And also I love music. And one of my favorite musicians is Caetano Veloso. Sergio Mendes is also a big pop star in Japan as well, and of course soccer, needless to say, and one of my favorite movie was directed by Hector Babenco, The Kiss of a Spider Woman. So
you know a lot about Brazil.
Yeah, and of course the martial arts, right? That's been very important. So. Brazil has, in a very sort of specific way, very important for me. But today, I'm going to try to focus on how Japan has been navigating the Trump years, as this poster shows, and I guess how we see the relations in Japan with the United States is particularly important these days because what Mr. Trump represents it might be something very significant. It might be just an aberration. We would see that in the 2020 election, or it might be a sign of something more structural. As people would say, Mr. Trump may not just be, or is not the cause. He may be the symptom. And if that is the case, Japan is faced with a very serious situation. So think about that topic. I would like to go back to 2016 and the kind of situation we were facing back then. Of course, in 2016, the U.S. president was still Barack Obama. And Japan generally appreciated, I would say, Barack Obama, because he focused on Asia-Pacific, and he called that a rebalance strategy. The understanding of the thrust of the rebalance strategy was that in the 2000s, sort of responding to the 9/11 terrorist attack, U.S. was focused almost exclusively on Middle East and countering terrorism. But that went a bit too far. That was the understanding of the Obama administration. So their thinking was that they had to rebalance in strategic terms and focus more on Asia. There were several pillars in this rebalance strategy. One was increasing or strengthening relations with allies and partners. That was the first pillar. But the second was trying to sort of forging a constructive relation with China. And third, sort of economic arrangements, multilateral economic arrangements. And fourth, sort of political security, multilateral framework. And fifth is about human rights and values. So those were the 5 lists. But this list was more like a laundry list of what you had to do, without sort of clearly assigning priorities. But I think policy is about priorities, and we see none of that priority in Obama's rebalance toward Asia. So it was a bit confusing which was the focal point, because sometimes forging a constructive relations with China and strengthening partnership with allies doesn't sort of, they sometimes might contradict. But they didn't really go into that contradiction. So it was always a mixed message to us. And also, there was this sense about the Obama administration that although he said he would focus on Asia or Asia-Pacific, that the basic understanding of how the Obama see the world and the role of America within it was that America should pull back. Right? You would call it retrenchment, I guess. Isolationism is I think, a too strong. It's I think, too strong of a word. So, for instance, what President Obama did in Syria, he said that if Assad uses the chemical weapons, that's the red line, and America would intervene, and he didn't. And in terms of Ukraine, there wouldn't have been much that America could have done, but the impression was that he was weak in the face of Russian sort of aggression. And that sort of image and the fact that the president himself did not pursue his promise on the red line issue had a big impact on the Asia-Pacific region as well. We totally understand the situation in Syria and Ukraine and situation we're facing back in Asia-Pacific is totally different. It is different. Because Syria and Ukraine is about new intervention. Whereas in Asia-Pacific, U.S. is already there. They have many alliance partners. They have bases in Japan, ROK, Philippines, etc. So it is totally different. In the Asia-Pacific, it is more about staying power rather than new intervention. But the issue was can we really trust this president's word? And the answer was, we're not sure. So President Obama himself was very popular among the Japanese people, especially his visit to Hiroshima. It was the first by the American president. And this was a very emotional visit on both sides. There were some disagreements even within President Obama's team. It is said that Susan Rice, his national security advisor, was against his visit, whereas Ambassador Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's daughter, was very willing or trying to convince President Obama to visit Hiroshima. And President Obama decided to go, and that made a very strong impact on the Japanese people. I think in the context of U.S.-Japan relations in the Obama era, it may have been the sort of the high moment when he visited. So his popularity was high, but among the foreign policy and security experts, there were doubts because of the reason I stated. So in 2016, of course, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was competing, and we never thought Mr. Trump would be the winner, as I think many of you saw back in 2016. And we thought Hillary Clinton would be sort of have the best mix or the best combination to deal with on the issue of U.S.-Japan alliance. There are a couple of reasons, but she represented the consensus of the American foreign policy establishment, I would say, and she was a bit more tougher on China than President Obama. At least that was our perception. And also, generally speaking, we saw her as a tougher version of President Obama. She was more, what would be the right word, muscular in terms of pursuing American foreign policy objectives. And in Northeast Asia, we still see a situation where national interests of sovereign nation states are clashing, and muscular American presence would benefit Japan and others. That was our perception. So we thought the alliance would be in a much better condition under the Hillary Clinton. So that's where we were at during 2016. We weren't fully satisfied with Obama. It wasn't all that bad, but we thought Hillary would be better. And we never even thought about Mr. Trump winning. Right? That was the 2016. And in fact, when Prime Minister Abe visited New York to attend the UN General Assembly back in September of 2016, he met Hillary Clinton without meeting Donald Trump. And you could see that as sort of like an intervention, right, in other countries' politics, because a prime minister endorsing one candidate to another could be seen as an intervention. But really, like I said, we didn't care because we never thought Donald Trump would win. That was the sort of our mindset at the moment. So we saw Mr. Trump win in November. It was a huge shock. I was literally on television, Japanese television, covering U.S. election live. And when the program started, I never doubted that Hillary would be the winner. And I was sounding as though she would be the winner. But as the sort of the program went on, you would see the other side sort of in a better position. And at a certain moment, I might be wrong. And I literally stopped talking for like 30 minutes on a live television show. And that's a disaster for a TV program, right? A professor who's supposed to be an expert stops talking for 30 minutes, right? But I just couldn't because I didn't really comprehend what was going on. So, and it's not just me. I think it's everybody, and Prime Minister's office, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and everybody was shocked. So what's important is that what does Mr. Trump represent? We know that he likes to use the term America first, or he likes to use the word American nationalism. I think he delivered a comprehensive sort of speech in explaining what American nationalism is in the last year's General Assembly at the United Nations. I didn't support what he said, but it was a very articulated sort of version or thinking of Mr. Trump's understanding of American nationalism. So I think there's several pillars. Right? There's one is that America has extended its responsibility too much. We're doing way too much. And the second is that America is no longer going to provide public goods at the expense of American people. And third is that America and American generosity is being exploited. And we're not going to be exploited anymore. And multilateral institutions are what constrains American foreign policy. And that strain of thinking always existed in American thinking, and especially on the conservative side. But Mr. Trump was on steroid on that point. He was extremely suspicious of multilateral arrangement. And also he said that the burdens, the alliance are burdens rather than force multiplier. And also treaties, obligations are what is an encroachment to American sovereignty. Right? So I think these elements consist American nationalism. And to put it bluntly, I think the message was, we're not going to uphold this liberal international order, whatever that is. I don't think he understood what that term meant, but we're not going to uphold this liberal international order anymore. In a country like Japan, you all know that we have a military alliance with the US. We have significant base presence within Japan. So US alliance is critical in Japan's national security policy. So yes, we rely on alliance. But even more than the alliance, I think we rely on this liberal international order that America upheld. Not America alone. We were also trying to uphold that in our region. But the America was in the business of liberal international order maintenance. Right? And if that sort of role is taken away from the US, of course, this liberal international order would start to shake. And that would be quite serious for Japan because, only few countries can shape the international environment around you, in the desire, according to your desires. Not many countries have the ability to shape the entire international environment. Therefore, I think these kind of order is important because a stable order makes the situation very predictable. And I think within the stable liberal international order, Japan recovered from the ashes of the World War II, and we succeeded economically and politically. So if this liberal international order starts to shake, it is as critical as this alliance system shaking. So that was the Trump's understanding of the world, and I think that's what American nationalism means. And also, this is going back to the campaign of 2016, we always used to complain that in the message of the candidates, that Japan is never mentioned, right? And in talking about Northeast Asia, it's always China that is being mentioned. And the Japanese media would complain. And of course, these days you can word count, right? So in a single speech, you can compare China was mentioned 8 times and Japan only once, right? And media would make a lot of noise about that. And we would always complain, right? Japan is not being mentioned. But looking back, the fact that we were not mentioned is good, right? Because UK would almost never be mentioned. France would not be mentioned because they're alliance partners. If you would be mentioned in the candidate's speech, that means you're not good news or you're bad news to the United States. So we should have been happy with that. But Mr. Trump was totally different in that respect because he never forgot to mention Japan as a candidate. He said that Japan, he lumped Japan together with China and said that Japan is a cheater in terms of trade. Right? The unfair tariffs, and that's the reason why. And the Japanese market, it is closed, and that's why there's a trade deficit between Japan and China. So it was mostly lumped together. Right? So he had this mindset of the 80s when Japan was rising, and many Americans thought, Japan was the next challenger. So we thought that, Mr. Trump's mindset is set back in the 80s. And also he mentioned that Japan is a free rider in terms of the alliance. And the blunt message that he sent us was that if you want to be protected, you have to pay more. That was the blunt message that Mr. Trump was saying. And, to be fair to him, he said this only once, so maybe I shouldn't emphasize this too much. But he said that Japan can go nuclear if you want. Nuclear meaning that Japan can have a nuclear weapon. And you would know what kind of impact that would have on the Japanese people. And also, this issue is at the heart of the alliance, right? U.S. would promise a maximal damage to an adversary if this adversary would attack Japan. Not that U.S. would always use nuclear weapons, but they would always leave the possibility so as to deter an attack against Japan. So this nuclear deterrence is at the heart of the alliance, right? So if U.S. says that Japan can go nuclear if you want, it means that we're not going to defend you sometimes, right? So it touches upon the heart and credibility of the alliance. So that was the message that we were being sent. Therefore, when we found out that Mr. Trump is elected, we were in shock. And I think the Japanese government was in shock as well. But to the compliments of the then ambassador to the U.S., Japanese ambassador to the U.S., he did remain in contact with the Trump campaign. From the media reports and from the rumors that I hear, the Hillary Clinton was extremely unhappy about Japan trying to retain connections with the Trump team, because Clinton team also thought Trump was going to never win. So Japan don't need to do that. So they weren't happy. So the main channel I hear remained in New York and Florida with Kushner, president's son-in-law. And that sort of worked out. And less than 2 weeks after the election, Prime Minister Abe went to Mr. Trump's home, right, Trump Tower in New York, Manhattan, and visited Mr. Trump. And this is very rare, and sometimes could be seen even as going against the diplomatic protocol, because there's only one president at a time, and still, President Obama was the president. So a Japanese prime minister or a leader of a certain country would not visit a president-elect until he is president, right? And this was covered heavily in the press because Prime Minister Abe was the first among the major nations to meet president-elect. So there were some criticisms, but I think it worked out. And you know that our prime minister has really good, even personal chemistry in relations with Mr. Trump. So one famous ambassador, a Singaporean ambassador called Bilahari Kaushkan, he said that, compared to Europe, Asians, we don't complain, we adapt. Right? That's what he said. But I would say that what we did was just more than that. I would say it was a radical adaptation to the situation that we were facing. I think this would have been very difficult for European leaders like Macron or Theresa May or Chancellor Merkel. And there are several reasons, I think, why we totally embraced Mr. Trump. And the interesting factor was that there are public support as well. Right? You couldn't sort of think of that in France or UK or in Germany. So then why is it the Japanese people, or first of all, Prime Minister Abe, decided to embrace Mr. Trump in light of the fact that President Trump was criticizing Japan all the time during the campaign. Right? And also the Japanese people supported Prime Minister Abe's decision as well. Why is that? So I think there are several reasons. The first one is quite straightforward. Right? If you think about the kind of situation that we're facing in Northeast Asia, it's a very hot spot, I would say. Most of all, China's rise and uncertainty, that sort of represents. And if you pile up what China is doing in the region, we don't see it as a positive trend. Of course, China has a positive aspect as well, mainly its economic and business chance. But even in those terms, as we see more recently, that that might complicate things than just a chance for Japanese business or economy. So what we're seeing in the region is a glimpse of China-centric order and Chinese hegemonic ambitions and trying to marginalize sort of American existence in the region. And we don't think that's good for the region, and we don't think that's good for Japan. So if you ask the Japanese people how important is U.S.-Japan relations to Japan and to the region, in 2017, the people would answer, this is both numbers of very important and important, right? The sum of that is 95.1%. 95.1% of Japanese people think American presence in the region is important for Japan and the region, of course, in a positive way. And in 2018, it was 94.5%, virtually the same number. And you can go back more further. So more than 90% in a row in a democracy is not what you would get usually, right? Japan is a consensual society, but you don't get it 90%. That's not it's unusual. So you can say that this is near consensus, right? So in terms of the security environment, we see U.S. presence as critically important. That's, I guess, number one. And the second element, the reason why Japanese people accepted Prime Minister Abe's embrace of Mr. Trump is, and also the reason why Prime Minister Abe decided to embrace Trump is that Japan lacks, or we don't see the rise of sort of right-wing nationalist-oriented populism, which we see in many other Western democracies. I would say we see almost none of that. There are, I think, several reasons. Right? One is that, as you know, Japan is a very homogenous society. Yes, I think we're becoming more diverse, that's for sure. But relatively speaking, I think we're quite homogenous, no doubt. And secondly, I think the media environment is quite different. And the Japanese press, especially the newspaper, yes, it's the number of publication is going down, that's for sure. But compared to other countries, we actually still read the papers, the newspapers. And social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and all that, they are popular, but they haven't really penetrated the political sphere. And that's a good sort of a vaccine for resisting fake news, right? Because people actually read the newspaper. And also, adding to that, Japanese politicians are not social media savvy, or they're very bad at it. So the social media and the political sphere is totally separated, I would say. Some politicians have tried to use social media for campaigns, but it hasn't really worked out. And I think that's good for democracy. And lastly, so that's why populists, right-wing sort of motivated populist sentiment doesn't exist. Therefore, we didn't see the dark side of the Trump phenomena, which Merkel, Theresa May, and Macron saw, right? Because they have their own alternative for Germany, Le Pen, and Brexit. Right? We had none of that. So we weren't quite aware of that side of Mr. Trump. So we didn't feel the need to resist the Trump phenomenon. And thirdly, I would say that for many Japanese who have never, of course, U.S. is the most popular destination. Many people has been to the United States, but people don't really understand. They just go to have some fun. So for many, Japanese, Mr. Trump is a typical American, right? Very loud, brash, and arrogant. And what's to be surprised about it? Right? So that attitude was surely there. And lastly, the contrast, and this might be the most important part, contrast with President Obama. Because we expect a strong leader, a tough leader in Commander-in-Chief of the United States, right? Because of the situation that we're facing in Northeast Asia, and because U.S. alliances is very important in Northeast Asia. But Obama was not a typical tough leader. I sort of categorize him as a postmodern president. He was intellectually very sophisticated. I would never hesitate him to teach a course on international relations or global governance in my university. Or I even would like to take his course on international relations or global governance. But being a commander-in-chief of the United States is very different from being an excellent professor on international relations. If you look at national security strategy that the Obama White House has published in 2015, and in the cover letter of that document, he says that the operating concept of the United States is strategic patience. Right? If you put the term strategic on it, everything seems like very geopolitical and very sort of well thought after. But in that context, strategic patience meant that you think more, you think deeply, and do nothing. Right? And also in the document, it doesn't. I'm sort of paraphrasing it. He didn't literally say it in this way, but it almost sounded like American primacy is no longer the strategic objective. And that made sense to a certain degree, because I said he's a postmodern president, right? And when I said he's a postmodern president, what I meant was that for him, the existential threat to the United States is global warming, pandemics, and those global governance-related issues. And they are, no doubt, serious issues. It could even destroy humankind, right? But pandemics, global warming, well, we know it's coming, but we don't know when, right? And he sort of marginalized the geopolitical issues that the world was facing. And when sort of we look at the situation in Northeast Asia, the situation in Northeast Asia is modern, typically modern. It's a clash of nations, clash of national interests. So President Obama comes to our region, talks about these postmodern threats, which is definitely important, which Japan is also very interested. But we want American president to sort of uphold liberal international order with a muscular American presence. And President Obama wasn't really interested in that. So Mr. Trump seems tougher We don't know he's really tough or not. But at least some of the speeches he has made, some of the speeches that his cabinet members and vice president has made, especially if you haven't seen it, maybe you should check it out. But the speech Vice President Pence delivered in early October in Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. This is a very tough speech against China. Sort of recognizing China as sort of a existential threat, that it is its motivation is to undermine the liberal international order and establish a sort of a China-centric order in the long run. And we always used to say that China is not Soviet Union because there are economic relationships, right? But this Pence speech at Hudson sort of would reverse the argument, and precisely because there is an economic relationship, it is more complicated. Because through that relations, they would steal the most sensitive military technologies. So that business relation, economic relations, would suddenly sort of be turned into a military threat. Therefore, it is much more complicated and much more of a challenge. That was the argument of Mr. Trump. So, in contrast to Mr. Obama, he seemed tougher on some of the issues. It doesn't quite turn out that way in the North Korean missile issue crisis. We're extremely worried about that. But our basic stance was that it's the president that Americans chose collectively, rather than complain, as Merkel, Macron, and Theresa May would do. It's better for us to adapt, and the Japanese public was also in full support of that. So I think you would think that Japan is not a small country, right? Even in geography, it's quite big than you would think. The only country bigger than Japan in Europe is France and Germany. I'm not sure. I think it's more bigger than Spain, in fact. It's bigger? But anyhow, we're not like a tiny little small country, right? Even in geographical terms. But definitely in size of economy, and even in military terms. Our defense spending is like the 7th in the world. So we have a significant, we call it self-defense force. Mainly, the mandate is to defend rather than attack. But we have significant defense capabilities. So why a country would Japan totally rely on Japan and sort of succumb to Trump? Aren't the people unhappy with it? Aren't you being sort of just like in this poster, like a small ship trying to counter a storm, and aren't you unhappy with that kind of situation? I think that would be the natural question that you would ask, right? But if you list up the list of options that we have, I mean, some may be hypothetical, right, for sort of brainstorming. I would list up 5. Right? The first is, okay, get rid of the alliance, and we can become a pacifist nation, as sort of envisioned in our Constitution. I think you've heard of our pacifist Constitution, right? Article 9 says that just get rid of all the weapons. We're not going to use military measures to pursue a national interest. That is what our Constitution says, right? So get back to that roots and stop all the alliances, become neutral. But for a country like Japan to totally disarm is, I think, very irresponsible. It would create a major power vacuum. And that will be a source of conflict, in fact. So we don't think that's a realistic option. And yes, pacifism used to be a very strain of thinking in Japan in the post-World War II period. But I think it's no longer the case. People do understand the serious situation in Northeast Asia. So a pure form of pacifism is not a solution. Right? So then what about the total opposite. Japan becoming a full-blown military power, even going nuclear. Some nuclear technician would tell that Japan can have nuclear weapons in a couple of months. But then others would say, we would not want a low-tech, crude nuclear weapon. We would like to have a best nuclear weapon if we decide to have one. So if it's that, maybe it would take 2 years. But it's not going to take a long time, right? So if there's a political decision, we can go nuclear. Right? But is there a public support for that? I would say almost none. Right? Japan is a democracy, so you have many people on the fringe. And some would, of course, argue for Japan go nuclear, but that's not an option. But maybe even, going not that far, in other terms, Japan would have the military capability to attack, not just to defend. But even that, I think the bar is quite high. The people's natural response would be, where's the money? Right? We don't have that kind of money. And I think, and also that the fact that we've been used to this system for so long, the self-defense force, Japan not having the attack capability, that I think it would be extremely difficult to change that strategic culture, and the Japanese people would not go on board. So I don't think that's an option as well. And the third option would be, what about some other alliances? Because the only alliance we have is the alliance with the United States. What about consider other allies? Right? In fact, we are engaging in a deepening defense cooperation and defense relations with countries like Australia, countries like India. They also some difficulties with sort of expansionism of China. Also with France. France is a Pacific country, like they have some islands. Mm-hmm. And also UK. And that's because I think UK is recently feeling a bit lonely, right, because of the Brexit and all that. So yes, we are deepening ties in terms of security with these countries. But the simple question is, would Indian Navy come and help Japanese maritime self-defense force in terms of pushing back sort of Chinese actions when something happens in East China Sea? And that's almost out of the possibility. Right? So yes, it's important for us to add on to what we already have. And think of it, Australia, France, UK is America's alliance partner. India, although not, but they're increasingly becoming more important to the United States. So deepening ties with these countries is not an alternative to the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's in addition to, right? So this doesn't work either. And regional organization, unfortunately, we don't have any regional organizations with teeth. Sometimes they're referred to just as talk shops, right? They talk and talk and talk, and basically that's it. And agree on the next meeting schedule, right? So the regional organization does. It's more about conversation, because China is there, North Korea is there. We can't really decide on a serious issue. It's more about conversation. So what about the global institutions? The UN Security Council is there to solve the issues. But think of it, the only veto holding power from Asia is China, right? And China is blocking us. We've been raising hands with Brazil and others that we would want to become a member of the Security Council as a permanent member. But it's not only China, but China is blocking this initiative. So no other alternative works, right? So there is the only option we have is the U.S. So I'm not being sarcastic or anything. In a literal way, I think Japan is a country without Plan B. But the good news is that the only option that we have is the best option if you compare with other options, right? And also, I said that Japan doesn't have a plan B, but we have a plan A dash, right? And that is that, yes, we will double down on the alliance because it's critically important, but it's not just totally about U.S. We are engaging in many other efforts. For instance, you've heard of CPTPP, or some would say TPP-11. That's TPP after U.S. withdrawing, right? We all thought by U.S. withdrawing, TPP would blow up in the air. But Japan and some others put a major diplomatic effort, showed a leadership where Japan is sometimes not, well, Japan always was known for its quiet leadership. But in the CPTPP case, we were quite vocal and visible about it, that we insist on trying to sort of retain this framework because it is good for the region. And we succeeded. And we succeeded in surviving the TPP. And also, there are many issues that Japan is interested in where U.S. is not. For instance, EPA with EU. We're in close in agreement on the economic partnership arrangement with the EU. A mega deal. Also, like on the Iran nuclear issue. Although we're not the party of that agreement, we're in full support of JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And U.S. has decided to opt out. Paris Agreement also. So we're not just following the steps of the U.S., but we're doubling down on these global governance management issues. So I would call that a plan A dash, although it's not plan B. Right?
Just if we could finish your
I'm-
just to have some
Okay,
time for people.
I'm getting to that.
Don't
So-
want to interrupt you, but
So this theory works if there is if American liberal international or American-led liberal international order and American commitment to support this would sort of survive the Trump era. That if Trump is in sort of aberration, Japan is comfortably with the scheme that I've explained. But if that is not the case, Japan would, in a longer run, be facing a serious situation. But I think our decision for now is that, try to convince the Americans that you have to be a resident power of the Asia Pacific. And in fact, that is what other neighbors want Japan to do. Because I think we have the most clout in having a conversation with the United States. So convince the Americans that you have to stay here. And that's the focus of Japan's, Japan navigating through the Trump years. So I will end here. Thank you.
thank you very much.